How's it going, everybody? I hope you're all doing well. Okay, so for the ancient Cynics, happiness wasn't found in wealth or comfort or social approval. No, it was found in freedom or self-sufficiency. And this freedom, it required a kind of radical simplicity. But here's the thing. To live simply, to reject the comforts and conventions of society, one had to train the body and the soul. So for the Cynics, physical toughness was not just a trait to admire. It was a discipline absolutely essential to happiness. You couldn't be happy if you weren't tough. Okay, so before I get into all of that, before diving into their views on how to live, it's worth quickly saying something about how much the Cynics admired Socrates. Actually, cynicism as a whole grew out of Socrates' life and ideas. So, for example, from Socrates, the Cynics took the idea that true happiness comes from living a good and a virtuous life, not from chasing pleasure. They also admired Socrates' self-control and his independence. You see, Socrates didn't care about money or comfort or status. No, he walked around barefoot, he wore the same old cloak, and he didn't seem to mind being poor. That kind of radical simplicity stuck with the Cynics. And I should add that, like Socrates, they also just didn't care what other people thought. Okay, but here's the thing to remember. In borrowing from Socrates, the Cynics, they cranked things up to 11. They took some of Socrates' ideas and they basically ran wild with them, while ignoring some of his other ideas. They didn't just imitate him, they pushed his examples to the edge. That's why Plato supposedly called Diogenes the Cynic. He called him Socrates gone mad. So in a way, we might think of the Cynics as something like the wild disciples of Socrates. Okay, so now, what did the Cynics argue for exactly? Well, so like I mentioned, for them, the key to happiness was freedom. And freedom, it came from needing almost nothing. In other words, the less you rely on comforts and luxury and approval, the freer you are. Diogenes once said that, while the gods need nothing, God, like humans, need very little. And actually, that echoed something that Socrates had said years earlier. He said, happiness isn't about having more, but it's about needing less. Now, this idea shows up in the famous stories about Diogenes. So apparently he lived in an old wine barrel and he owned almost nothing, just a cloak and a walking stick and a bag. And he was still totally happy. One legendary story drives this point home. So Alexander the Great came to visit Diogenes, curious about this strange and weird philosopher. He found him lying in the sun and he asked, "Is there anything that I can do for you?" Now Diogenes looked up at him and he said, "Yeah, can you move? You're blocking my sunlight." Later, Alexander told his men, "If I weren't Alexander, I would be Diogenes." Now that moment says it all. Diogenes has nothing, but he lacks nothing. He's content with a little patch of sunlight. Even the most powerful man in the world can't offer him anything that he truly wants. His real power then comes from his incredible power of self-mastery, not from armies. In this sense, he has more power than any tyrant ever will. Okay, but so far, I haven't said much about the toughness that I mentioned earlier. So what the Cynics believed is that to be truly free, you had to train yourself. Like an athlete, but for life, not for trophies. Now they called this type of training ascesis, and it meant hard physical and mental discipline. A word, by the way, from which we get ascetic or asceticism. Anyway, so it's for this reason that Diogenes thought of himself as a kind of a philosopher athlete. The only difference being that while athletes trained for glory, he trained for strength of will. In other words, he wanted to toughen up his mind and his body so that he could handle anything that life threw at him. Now, how did he do this? What was his training or workout strategy? Well, basically, his approach here was to deliberately make life harder for himself. For example, he drank only water, he ate simple food, and he slept on the ground. He even rolled in hot sand in the summers and hugged cold statues in the winter, and he even tried to eat raw meat. The point was to become unshakable, to build a kind of inner armor so that fortune couldn't touch his peace of mind. So for the Cynics then, real happiness came not from changing the world to suit you, but from changing yourself to need less from the world. And you did this by hardening your body and your mind, not pampering it. You had to deliberately expose yourself to discomfort. And again, here the aim was not just the development of strength. No, the aim was liberation. By learning to need less, you feared less. By enduring pain willingly, you became untouchable. And from this freedom came real happiness. Now, the opposite of all this, the sure path to anxiety and frustration and misery, well, that was to become dependent and soft and to avoid hardship and to always take the path of least resistance. This is simply not a good strategy to prepare for what life will soon or eventually throw at you. You know, speaking of the path of least resistance, I can't help but to think of how relevant the Cynic message is for us today. I mean, in our contemporary world where comfort is king and where every inconvenience gets an app and where there's an Uber around every corner and where we're constantly encouraged to treat ourselves, the Cynic message lands like a serious challenge. In other words, what if our unhappiness doesn't come from having too little, but from depending on too much? And what if all of our trying to feel good, through purchases and useless distractions is exactly what's keeping us brittle and anxious and unhappy? Because, let's be honest, we've got increasingly curated and comfortable lifestyles, yet rates of anxiety and depression have never been higher. Our way of life is more plush than ever before, and yet we're more restless than ever before. Is it possible that the very ease that technology affords us is weakening us? That our obsession with avoiding discomfort and inconvenience is robbing us of real toughness and strength of character? I think the Cynics would definitely say yes. What they'd say is that we've confused comfort with freedom, and we've confused softness with happiness. And they'd encourage us to flip that script, not by hugging cold statues and sleeping in barrels, but by intentionally not always taking the path of least resistance, by building a bit of voluntary discomfort into our lives. Not to suffer for its own sake, of course, but to grow stronger and to grow more grounded and less dependent. To practice needing less so that we can be afraid of less. Because, and this is the kernel of it, when nothing can be taken from you, then no one can take your happiness. So, maybe getting tougher isn't about posturing or proving anything to anybody. Maybe it's not macho or masochistic. Maybe it's just smart and pragmatic. Maybe it's the most radical kind of self-care that there is, the kind that trains you to stand firm in a world that won't always go our way. The kind that prepares you not for a life of constant ease, but for a life of inevitable difficulty. And maybe, just maybe, that's the kind of strength that leads not just to survival, but to real, invulnerable happiness. Bye for now.